I've got a question for all Americans watching this. Let's say that somehow I become the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. Somehow, I don't know. And after I become Prime Minister, I notice something that the government in the USA is doing, which I don't like. And let's also say that I send an email to the President of America and the Congress saying something like, if you don't stop doing that and do what I tell you, then we, Great Britain, are going to invade you and take over. What do you think the reaction would be of the USA in 2024? I think we all know the answer to that. But it wasn't always like this. The Ribblehead Viaduct has a somewhat tenuous connection to the last time anybody, I think, forced the American government to do something that they didn't want to. I'll explain. The Ribblehead Viaduct down there was built by a workforce of over 7,000, and they lived in camps on the site. And one of the sites was called Sebastopol, which is just to the left of the viaduct at the moment. And that's where they made most of the bricks which were used in the construction of the viaduct. There were a few camps with different names, but Sebastopol was named after a siege in the Crimean War. Well, I think that was in 1854. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong about that. Anyway, the reason the camp was called that, Sebastopol, is that some of the engineers working on the viaduct had served in the British Army in the Crimean War, and they ended up down there. And they returned to Britain on the RMS Trent. This was a ship that almost caused another war between the UK, or GB, and the USA. I'm sure Americans will remember the RMS Trent from their school days. But if you don't, and anybody else, I'll jog your memory. At the start of the American Civil War, which was between the Union in the north and the Confederates in the south, I think it was from 1861 to 65. Anyway, at that time, Napoleon had been beaten, the Russians had lost in the Crimea, and basically Great Britain was the only military superpower in that day. And in the American Civil War, Britain was officially neutral. You know, it recognized both the North and the South as belligerents. Oh, at the time, only a nation could be a belligerent in a war. So this meant that from a European legal viewpoint, we considered them basically two countries at war, rather than one section or the other being in revolt. And this was important to Britain. You know, as a country at war, it had to stick to various international laws. But at the time, a revolutionary wasn't covered by those same laws. And this, obviously, this meant that Great Britain could continue to trade with both the North and the South. And so the profits kept rolling in for the merchants, who then paid tax on those profits, you know. And so as long as Great Britain stayed out of things, everything was looking good, you know, from London, as the tax kept rolling into the government. But even though Great Britain was neutral, you know, its embassy was in the north. And legally, this meant that, you know, at the time, America was still one country, and there could only be one official embassy. And this upset the leader of the South. I think his name was Jefferson Davis. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong. I know virtually nothing about American history. This is all just waffle. Anyway, Mr. Davis decided to send a couple of diplomats, Mr. Mason and Mr. Slidell, over to Europe to see if they could persuade the Europeans to give the South some help, both diplomatic and military. Mr. Mason and Mr. Slidell headed off to Cuba, and they took a British government mail ship called the Royal Mail Steamer Trent, or just the RMS Trent. You know, they took it over a voyage over to Europe. Now, RMS Trent was intercepted in the Atlantic by a Union warship, and Mr. Mason and Mr. Slidell were both taken off the ship by a boarding party and arrested. And then they were taken to the north and put in jail. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that the ship was British, and Britain wasn't at war with either the Confederate forces in the south or the Union forces in the north. So, taking anyone off a ship, regardless of their nationality, was an illegal act under British law and under international maritime law. Another thing to bear in mind is that in the early 1860s, Great Britain was almost at the height of its imperial power. And as I said, it was the world superpower at the time. The British Empire then had around 400,000 full-time professional soldiers in its army. It had by far the largest navy in the world, with over 700 modern warships. And at the start of the Civil War, remember, the Union in the north had access to about 45 combat-ready warships. You know, how things have changed, eh? It's not like that anymore. Anyway, the press and the politicians in London, they were all shouting about this illegal act, you know, which they called an insult to British sovereignty. And many people, you know, in power were actually calling for a war to avenge the attack, you know, on the RMS Trent. So a letter was sent to Mr. Lincoln, who was the president of the Union, and he demanded the release of the 2 Confederate diplomats and a public apology. Mind you, from school I remember this, the idea was never to invade the east coast of America, but the plan talked about the most was to use the massive Royal Navy to transport the British army from all over the world, from places like Britain itself, from India, South Africa, Australia, etc., etc. And these would join the thousands of British troops who were already in Canada. And this would mean that the Union Army would need to not only fight the Confederates in the south, but they would also need to fight the British in the north. Now, luckily, Mr. Lincoln backed down, and he ordered the release of the 2 Confederate diplomats. I forget that. Oh, Mr. Mason and Mr. Slidell. But Mr. Lincoln refused point blank. He refused to give the British a public apology as they'd asked for. So it was win-win. You know, both sides were able to save face and a war was averted. And this whole affair then simmered down, and as always, Britain kept out of the American problems, you know. But don't forget that there was still profit to be made, you know. So if you're ever up here looking down on the Ribblehead Viaduct, that thing down there, then think about the men who built it and the RMS Trent, which carried them back from the Crimean War. And what on earth has this got to do with Harvey's maps? I honestly don't know. So I'm going to carry on, keep walking up until I get to the summit of Simon Fell. It is really cold up here. I'll carry on.